Welcome to the Leader's Way podcast. I am really, really excited about this conversation because we'll be chatting about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is mysticism, specifically Christian mysticism, specifically one of the great mystics of the Christian tradition, Meister Eckhart. I spilled more than a little ink in my doctoral dissertation examining Meister Eckhart's sermons, his thinking as it pertains to the contemplative life, and especially as it his thinking and some of the themes that he returns to over and over in his work align with themes in Zen Buddhism. And interestingly enough, teachings from Zen that originated exactly the same time period, but in a completely different cultural context in Japan. Anyway, I've long wanted to go even deeper and spend more time studying Meister Eckhart, and I was so thankful to remember that we have on faculty here at Yale Divinity School a wonderful scholar of Eckhart, who is Volker Leppin. And I'm conscious as we start this conversation that the word mysticism is so elastic in our culture. And for folks who are interested in mysticism or use the word mysticism, the word gets used in a variety of different ways. And it's one of those great words in the Christian tradition that we use, but we often use imprecisely, or we use without even a real fair grasp of what we're referring to. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about our wonderful guest, Professor Volker Leppin. As the Horace Tracy Pitkin Professor of Historical Theology, Professor Leppin's scholarship is particularly interested in medieval and Reformation studies. He argues that the Reformation should be understood as a transformation of the medieval world rather than a stark rupture. His work also focuses on the history of spirituality, mainly in mysticism. He's been educated at the University of Marburg, Heidelberg University, and he received a chair in church history at the University of Jena in 2000. 10 years later, he moved to the University of Tübingen in southern Germany, where he held the chair in church history and directed the Institute for Late Middle Ages and Reformation from 2010 to 2021. He's a member of the Academies of Sciences at Heidelberg, as well as the Saxonian Academy of Sciences. His most recent book, among many, many that he's written, is Francis of Assisi, The Life of a Restless Saint. I'm so thankful for this conversation, and I hope you enjoy our exploration of mysticism, Meister Eckhart, Francis of Assisi, Martin Luther, and so much more. Welcome to the Leader's Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We convene sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who explore the creative vision needed to lead change in our aching world. I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, lecturer at Yale Divinity School and executive director of the Office of Transforming Leaders at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. I'm so glad you're here. Professor Volker Leppin, welcome to the Leader's Way podcast. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Gosh.
I would love you to begin by telling your story. How did you find your way here to Yale Divinity School as a scholar and an academic?
So, of course, it started in Germany. It started from me to being a pastor's son, which is very traditional in Germany. So many theologians will come out of the Deutsche Pfarrhaus, being trained in religion, being trained in a lot of education. And at high school, I had many kind of Marxist friends, atheist friends. We came into discussions. We agreed about many things, ethical things, but we disagreed about metaphysics and faith. And that brought me to study theology. I wanted to know deeper. And then throughout my studies, I found some authors I found fascinating, like William of Ockham, about whom I wrote my dissertation. And after writing my dissertation, I thought, oh, it's fun to stay in academics. So as we Germans do, I wrote a second book, the so-called Habilitation, to be qualified for a professor. And that was more about the Lutherans in the 16th century. That was my start. And then I came to a very interesting university in Eastern Germany around 2000. So that was 11 years after the fall of the wall. Still, you had this transformative atmosphere in Jena, in Eastern Germany. I made my way to Tübingen, a very traditional, very well-esteemed faculty in Germany. And in my mid-50s, I thought, that was all great, but there's still something in my career, in my life, and Yale came up, and I thought, that's another place to learn and to go there. And fortunately, Yale wanted me to come in, so I agreed.
We're thankful you did. Can I hear about what it was like growing up in a divided Germany and what that moment was like when the wall came down?
Oh, that is a good question. So growing up in this divided Germany really meant Germany ended for me at this iron wall. So I still remember when I was 16 or so, I said, Paris is closer to me than Leipzig. So Leipzig is in Eastern Germany. And of course, Paris, they speak French. The guys there in Leipzig, they speak German. And my grandmother, she had studied in Leipzig. I was surprised as a 16-year-old to hear this. So there was a map in my mind that was the divided Germany. And honestly, when this division of Germany ended, I didn't find this natural or normal. My father then said, all right, it's back to normality. I said, no, it's very unnormal. I found it was a right punishment for Germany to be divided. That was my mindset. That took only 1 week or so. And after a while, I said, all right, it is becoming natural. When I was in Heidelberg in southern Germany there, and when first someone from GDR with this special kind of cars, the Trabi, came to Heidelberg, and I noticed that we can talk together. They are happy people. They are great people. Then very, very quickly, I understood that's the time for us to come together. But it would be wrong to say that I was always expecting what happened there. And it would be wrong to say, I hoped for this. It was a process of learning.
Wow. Over time, you came to study mysticism. And this is, of course, the reason that I invited you to the Leaders Way podcast. I'm so excited for this. I've been interested in mysticism for so long. I'm always curious when I hear people within church contexts, outside of church contexts, talk about mysticism. And so I'd love for you to share just a little bit today about your academic study of mysticism. But before we even venture into this territory, I always feel like a definition of terms is necessary. And this is one of these especially slippery words.
Yeah,
help us navigate what this word means, what it might not mean, or maybe even the polyvalence. I suspect it means many things.
Yeah, thank you for broadening it. You said a definition is necessary. If you mean an exact definition is necessary, we should end up our conversation. I couldn't deliver. So it is more like I try to approach mysticism by a set of criteria, a set of moments. The most important moment to me is all mystics think in a certain way about being close to God, being personally close to God. So you have the experience, the sacrament of God coming close to you. Mysticism doesn't need anything that mediates in this way as the sacrament does. So that's very much in the center. Then mysticism mostly is about God being somehow spiritual, immaterial. God can materialize within mysticism in a very bodily way, but the first approach is God is very immaterial. A third moment would be to come close to this immaterial God. Something has to happen in me. I have to lose what binds me to any material surrounding of me. if I describe it in a kind of churchy way, that's penance, that brings me to my inner, that lets me detach from my sinful attachment to the material world. So going through penance, going into me, that brings me closer to God, which now as a fourth item would mean I find God more in my interior than outside of me. I think that's pretty much a sample. I could add some more items, but that's the kernel of it.
Mm-hmm. And what in your own life led you to make this the object of your scholarly pursuits? Was there a moment, a text that opened this door that you've walked through?
It was a number of texts. It was actually Meister Eckhart. In the time when I studied, I got an offer for a summer school, which was about Meister Eckhart, led by historians of literature who were very much interested in this kind of texts, right? Metaphors you find in Meister Eckhart. And there I found these texts eye-opening, heart-opening. And I say this as someone who really loves the intellectual debates. As I said, I started with scholasticism with William of Ockham, and I love this. But mysticism gives another approach to searching for words about God, and in the same way of searching for words, also disclosing that your words are not enough. And that very much resonates with my own experience.
Yes. If you're enjoying the Leaders Way podcast, you might like to join us in person as a Leaders Way Fellow. The Leaders Way at Yale is a certificate program exploring spiritual innovation for faith leaders. The Leaders Way at Yale combines the best of Divinity School, retreat, and pilgrimage. Fellows meet in person at Yale for a week over the summer, then continue their learnings and mentor groups online. You can also take an online course or workshop with us here at Yale. Our learning space for faith leaders is hopeful, practical, and imaginative. Learn more on our website at berkeleydivinity.yale.edu. Clergy and leaders from every country, denomination, and seminary background are warmly welcome to join us for all of our programs. Now, back to the show. So let's dive into our beloved Meister Eckhart. For those who maybe have only heard the name or know the slightest bit, this might be an opportunity to go a little bit deeper than usual. You've just finished teaching a course on Meister Eckhart here at Yale Divinity School. What would you like us to know and remember about Meister Eckhart, namely the things that we might tend to forget or not hear when we, quote him quickly?
So what we very often forget is that he was one of the leading scholastics of his time. He taught twice at Paris, and he wrote Latin texts, commentaries to the Bible, to the Gospel of John, to the Genesis, on a very high level of Neoplatonic philosophy. That's something mostly we don't have in mind when talking about him. We have in mind, and that's great that we have this in mind, his German sermons, which are not easy to identify. So there is a good number of sermons which were delivered under his name, and some Germans which were not delivered under his name, but research says they are written by him nevertheless. But now I think we have a good number of around 100 sermons which center around this idea of detachment, the German word Gelassenheit. It's one interesting thing in Meister Eckhart that he coined some German terms like this Gelassenheit, like Bildung. I think Bildung even is a word in the English-speaking world about something of education, but also shaping a personality. That's what Bildung means. This German word was invented by Meister Eckhart, so as we can tell. So he was very creative in using German language. He was creative in using images, in using uncommon thoughts about God. And still nowadays, when you read Meister Eckhart, you can just be surprised by what he is thinking and saying.
That was my experience reading him for the first time, I guess as an undergraduate, thinking it was quite shocking, some of the metaphors, and surprising. And who would he have been preaching to, most of the sermons that we have?
An obvious audience, these are his Dominican brothers.
His Dominican community.
And there is another number of sermons. We do not know how many of those sermons which are directed to spiritual women, and that makes it so interesting. He was committed by his order to care for those spiritual women who had been outside the orders, the beguines, who had their self-organized life, and now were integrated into the Dominican order. He was the one to lead them spiritually, and in leading them, he also learned from them. And that makes it fascinating to read him. You see what biblical figures he talks about. He talks about Martha and Mary, those sisters who received Jesus. This famous story in the Bible, in the Gospel of Luke, where Mary is just listening to Jesus, just sitting at his feet. And Martha, her sister, is working behind her as a good host, working for the guests. And then when Martha asks Mary, please help me, Jesus says, no need of this. She has chosen the better part, which is me for Mary. So I don't want to be Martha here. And this story was read by many women in the sense of, oh, you just have to listen, you just have to be a visionary. Meister Eckhart corrects them slightly, saying, no, if you want to have this visionary life, this life of auditing Jesus Christ, you also have to go through a time in your life where you are Martha. You also have to work in this world. And this is so counterintuitive to what we think about a mystic. We wouldn't think a mystic sends you into the world. He sends you into working. He says, Mary, before becoming the right Mary, she worked for the apostles. He even says, like the tradition says, she preached, which is a great acknowledgement that she was the one who taught the gospel to the apostles. And that's everything about working, doing something. And he says, that's part of your spiritual reality.
And he lived, as I understand it, a form of this kind of integration. As you mentioned, the theologian teaching at Paris at times, known most as a mystic, but did he also have administrative responsibilities within his own Dominican order that I'm tracking?
Oh, yes, he was the biker leader of a province. Then he even had to lead a province. So he was really one of the most active Dominicans of his time. If you look at him, you don't know how he could do all of this in his life. But he did. He managed to do so, and he still managed to provoke thoughts by others.
Yeah. When you think about some of the great themes of Meister Eckhart, are there a handful of themes that you find him returning to again and again?
He even says himself in one of his sermons, whenever I preach about Abgeschiedenheit. This is kind of reclusion. It's always difficult to translate it into English. Honestly, it is strange for me. You mentioned the classic. It is strange for me to read him in English. So I always wonder how this translation is made. But we have very good translations into English. So, however, he speaks about this reclusion, which is a parallel to detachment, Gelassenheit. So that's, as he himself says, that's his main theme. Just getting rid of all your ties to this earth. And then he says, I speak about God who comes close to me. As I said, in Mystic Convictions, God comes close to us in a way that draws us into God themselves.
Mm-hmm. Many moons ago, when I was preparing a doctoral dissertation, I wrote a chapter on Meister Eckhart and Zen, and this idea of detachment. And many of our contemporary Zen teachers prefer the word non-attachment in their own teaching because it's less dualistic.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a fair companion word to use. So whenever I'm teaching about detachment, I find myself often also using the word non-attachment. So this is kind of a part one of the question. And part two of the question is detachment for the sake of what? I presume that detachment might be linked to something else, to another principle. Is it love? Is it compassion? Is it faith? How does Meister Eckhart understand that?
In my living between two cultures linguistically, between German and American culture, I usually learn we Germans tend to have a very nominalistic style, while the American style is more active, using verbs. And now in this sense, detachment is more American than non-attachment is, because the German word of Gelassenheit in itself has the word lassen, leave, which means there is a relation. I leave it behind. I leave it back somewhere. While non-attachment would, at least to my mind, be more static in the sense it is nowhere. There is no relation to it. For Meister Eckhart, there is a relation. There is a process of leaving it behind. So that's why I would prefer detachment.
Detachment, yeah.
If not taught otherwise.
Yes.
So, and the second question about how does it lead to, in a certain sense, it doesn't lead to anything. It leads to the nothing. That's what Meister Eckhart would call the nicht, the nothing. And of course, in this nothing, then there's everything. There's God. But first, it has to go to the nothing. Nothing. One of those terms both Meister Eckhart and John Towner would use to describe it is the biblical word of the abyss. So you go into this abyss, and then the true abyss, God themselves, will be there.
Yes, and this is what has been fascinating to track, and I don't know the extent to which you've tracked this conversation between some members in the Zen community trying to engage Meister Eckhart around this notion of nothingness, and there's sort of a camp that says, "Gosh, they're actually sort of articulating the same thing," and others say, "Well, simply because they're saying nothing or nothingness doesn't mean they're actually pointing to the same quality of nothingness, right?" And so, I spent a chapter opining and probably getting it really wrong on this, but I wonder if this is in any way related to what, like, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing is trying to point to, in the sense of is it a kind of releasing of notions, ideas? Is this the same kind of ballpark?
It is so. The author is later than Meister Eckhart. I cannot say if he draws from him or from Tauler, but actually it is the same thought of, getting detached from everything here. Yeah.
And yet, as we've just talked about, Meister Eckhart is quite engaged in the world. So the detachment, can you say more about this? Is it a detachment from ideas, detachment from worldly identity while still being in the world? Is he preserving a kind of paradox here? He's not, it seems, he's not living a purely monastic life, right? He's a Dominican, so, engaged as a mendicant. So how is he thinking about detachment?
Very short answer, he would say it's detachment of myself. So that's what I say in the center. More elaborated, I would say it is a mental thing. He has one passage, not in a sermon, but in a treatise, where he thinks about, can I be rich and detached and poor at the same moment? And he says yes. So if you are rich, but you don't care about this, then you are poor in your mind, which is not easy to handle, I think, but that's the idea. Of course, that's also an idea that might help people to arrange themselves with the world and saying, I'm detached and I'm rich, and I don't care about my money, just go back to my big mansion and live there. That's not how he means it. He means really in this sense of that hasn't to count in any sense for you. And this mental detachment that goes so far that he stresses you must not have any kind of will in you. And this not having any kind of will goes so far that he says, even when you want to perform the will of God, still you have a will in you, and that's too much. Wow. So that's biblically, that's what happens to Jesus in Gethsemane. Not my will, but your will.
Yes. What do you think we get most wrong about Meister Eckhart? I mean, he's in the air these days, and folks are quoting him in sermons. You can Google Meister Eckhart and come up with, 25 quotes on Goodreads or something. And I think I'm quite sure he didn't say this, or the translation.
25 quotes are wrong, I think.
Yeah. So, when this bubbles up in when this bubbles up in popular culture, how do you handle it? And what do you think we typically get wrong?
Typically, we understand him too simple. We don't take this whole philosophical background into our thoughts about him. But as you say, how do I deal with it? I wouldn't say too quickly you understand him wrong, but more in the sense of, oh, great that you have an understanding and let's go deeper. I love it that people love Meister Eckhart, and that's a great chance for us as theologians to come into touch with people who might not have an understanding of religion in a churchy sense, who feel estranged from the church. And maybe that's a second point which many people misrepresent. In Meister Eckhart, they think he's somewhere in the air beyond the church. He was very much involved in the church. Even if this church in the end condemned him, he always felt to be a good Catholic in his time. And so coming into talk with people who take him into a more esoteric understanding and tell them, all right, he also could talk about Jesus Christ. He could talk deeply about the incarnation, and there is some relation to this.
We were just having this same kind of conversation last week with Omid Safi. I don't know if you know his work. He's a scholar at Duke who translates Rumi. And he bumps into this same kind of problem, right?
Course, yeah.
When we extract someone like Rumi or someone like Meister Eckhart out of their context, typically what happens is we tend to make them very non-religious and almost therapeutic. And he was describing a kind of a cartoon that he saw. Of course, Rumi writes prolifically about love, is often talking about divine love. He's sometimes talking about human love too. But the cartoon said, it was a caption of Rumi, and the caption read, "I'm not talking about your girlfriend." So I'm talking about God here. So I wonder if we need a similar kind of cartoon when it comes to Meister Eckhart. Tell us about the end of his life and how things transpired and sort of where Meister Eckhart sits now. Maybe you could speak sort of largely in terms of how the Christian tradition writ large embraces him, but also maybe how the Roman Catholic Church at the current moment sees Eckhart.
Yes, starting with the end of his life, he ran into trouble when he was in Cologne. There were some local conflicts, obviously some debates with his brothers, including that they were suspicious about him talking about speculative things to the broader public. And he answered it in a great way. He said, if you don't talk to the uneducated, never ever anyone will be educated, which totally makes sense. But it didn't make sense to his adversaries. So they continued to pursue him, and he applied to the papal court, which at that time was situated in Avignon because the papacy had removed from Rome. And he went there. We know quite well about the process that was made against him. It ended up that he was released from Avignon, and a number of sentences was condemned, and this bull says somehow that he understood that these sentences were wrong and he would not repeat them, which meant if he had not died on his way, he could have continued teaching in a certain way. But now he died, and there was this condemnation which made it very difficult to transmit his sermons. That's why, as I mentioned before, so many sermons of him are transmitted under no name or under another name. Many of them were transmitted under the name of John Tauler, because John Tauler was not condemned as a heretic. And that brought it with it that over centuries, John Tauler was much better known than Meister Eckhart was.
So, is that right?
Yeah, it is. So you have those prints of John Tauler in the 15th and 16th century. You have no print under the name of Meister Eckhart.
Huh.
And then you can see that the name was known. There was this German thinker, Meister Eckhart. He was mentioned in some texts, but people didn't know what he actually had written. That only started in the 19th century in the circle around the philosopher Hegel, where people redetected Meister Eckhart, and then his sermons were published. And that also brought some Catholic thinkers into, connection with him. So that through the 19th and 20th century, I would say more and more Catholic thinkers would say there is something inspirational in Meister Eckhart's thought. I know, for example, that someone who wrote his dissertation about Meister Eckhart now is a bishop in Germany, so that is possible, that you appreciate Meister Eckhart. He is one of the intellectual interlocutors for Catholic theology nowadays. And I would not have been surprised if Pope Francis had acknowledged him somehow, and I won't be surprised if Pope Leo will do, because he also can appreciate this strong intellectual tradition.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if we could go back in time. Maybe I should have started with my St. Francis question. We could have gone more linearly, but you've also written on Francis and the mysticism that in some ways, I presume, has an overlap in the Venn diagram with Meister Eckhart, but is very distinct and different. So, what prompted your writing and scholarship on this beloved St. Francis?
There's one route tracing back very far back into my youth, and another more recent route that brought me to Francis. What goes so deeply back is growing up in a pastor's house. My father was a pastor in Marburg in Germany in St. Elizabeth Church, which is a church built in the 13th century for Elizabeth of Hungary. And Elizabeth of Hungary was one of the first in Germany to propagate the ideas of St. Francis. So that when I was a young boy, I was sitting in this old church and I saw stained windows. On one of them, there was a strange figure in a blue coat that was St. Francis. So I very early in my youth encountered St. Francis. That's very back in my youth. And more recent, in another part of my life is being a researcher on Martin Luther.
Yes.
And that means I had a lot to do in the year 2017, which was the Reformation Jubilee. I think I had 80 talks around the world in this year. I don't know how I mentioned this in that year, and all was about Luther. And Luther is a great guy, but there was a moment of being exhausted of Martin Luther. And when I flew back from my last travel for talks, that was in Taiwan in October, November 2017, I took the Francis works with me and I just read them on the plane, and I was excited about this. And that was the starting point for my Francis book.
Oh my goodness. So I studied in Italy when I was an undergrad, and our first 3 days in Italy, we went right from the airport to a 3-day retreat in Assisi.
Right.
And I thought, I want to give my whole life to Francis and to Jesus. And so, so I picked up the Omnibus, which for folks who don't know is this great honking book of all things Francis related, and poured through it and wrote at least a dozen papers on Francis of Assisi and entered. And, I'll spare you the details. I didn't end up as a Franciscan, but his way of life continues to inspire, to, activate something in the imagination of people worldwide. And for folks who might only know the Reader's Digest version, that only know the shortest version of the story, can you share just a little bit about the narrative of Francis, and then this mystical dimension, the stigmata, and his embracing of lepers, I presume, features really prominently in your research.
So the basic story is a young son of a merchant who comes to understand that his father might be a Christian or his parents might be Christians, say, in a certain sense, but he feels a tension between this way of living Christianity to what he becomes to understand from the gospel, by the help of a priest, by the way, who explains him something, but also by his own resonating about what Jesus wants from us. There is a symbolic story in his life that makes clear how different he was to his parents very early. This is when he thought about the sick. There was who suffered from lepra. They lived outside the city, and usually a rich man like his father would send someone to them to give them money or some food, or also being a Christian who gives a donation, but also being very distant. What did St. Francis? He went to them, he embraced them, and he kissed them. I would say maybe nothing to imitate. We know how dangerous kissing might be. We went through a pandemic, but given that this is not a medical advice, it is very impressive because it shows he didn't see I have to donate, but he saw the person. He saw this person is in need of love. Mm. And as he later says in his testament, indeed, the starting point for his life, for his conversion, was going to the sick, going to the lepers. So he started and then the conflict with his father arose, and he gathered a group around him who wanted to live this life of penance. After a while, this group became so big that he felt overwhelmed. He withdrew himself from the leading of this group. He returned to a life as an hermit, and that's why, maybe or not, I would say perhaps not, he received the stigmata. So my understanding is that the stories say about the stigmata, the wounds of Jesus Christ in his body, only came up after his death, and they gave expression to maybe even a visionary experience. This one was really the second Jesus Christ. And if I believe that this was true physically or not, that doesn't matter. I think the theological message, that is very much right, that there's someone lived so radically following Jesus Christ, not caring of himself. He was so sick in his last years, only caring for the others. That is a message of Jesus Christ in this world. Mm-hmm. And so this speech about the Alter Christus, the second Christ, which came up 100 years after his death, that is very true. Mm.
If I'm remembering my history correctly, Francis, maybe like Ignatius of Loyola, had dreams of fighting in the army. Certainly Ignatius of Loyola did. I don't know, did Francis fight, or he had chivalric aspirations to fight and win noble glories, right? And that gets transposed into a very dramatic kind of sense of discipleship. Am I remembering my history
It is actually like Ignatius. He fought in a war between Assisi, his mother town, and Perugia.
In Perugia, right?
He was even in prison, war prison, for a year. In his youth, which was somehow dramatic and which formed his mindset to a certain degree. And then he had this dream about a room full of weapons, and he learned more and more it is about the spiritual weapons. So the fight you fight is not between Perugia and Assisi or whatsoever, but it is the fight against your own wills. And that's, you introduced Francis as being somewhat close to Meister Eckhart. Let's say, indeed, we can say that it's close to Meister Eckhart and to mysticism in general. That he said it is not about my own will, my own desires. It is all about God, whom I experience in my neighbor and in creation.
As you teach Francis, I mean, what connections are you making between Francis and sort of the urgent needs of the world? What are some of the themes that you hope your students and your readers take away as they engage in someone who lived and died 800 years ago now?
Yeah. So there is an obvious connection which also Pope Francis make very much clear. St. Francis was someone who understood that nature is something we should not use for ourselves, which we should read as a mirror of God. That's how he approached nature. Of course, he had no understanding as we have about the ecological structure. Of course, he couldn't know that our behavior is destroying nature, is destroying the fundaments of life. He couldn't know that. But he saw this nature is made by God, and in this nature we will still find traces of God. So when he sounds like someone who very much appreciates nature, that has always to do with God and Jesus Christ. Just to take one example, there is a story that he was picking up a worm from the soil and protecting this worm, that no one would come with their feet on the worm. And this is explained by Psalm 22, where a worm is mentioned, and in Christian tradition, this worm is Jesus Christ. So the worm he's protecting, that's a symbol of Jesus Christ. And if we approach nature this way, to see that there is God present in a certain way, there's Jesus Christ present in a certain way, not ontologically, but in the way that all these are signs leading us to God, then we will protect nature.
Mm-hmm. And do I understand, and is this more apocryphal or is this a history, that Francis is responsible for the first nativity?
That is likely historical. So he had this celebration with all ingredients of say a nativity. It was not like a nativity under the Christmas tree, but it was a scenery of the nativity in which he celebrated the Eucharist. So of course he was not a priest, so he was not presiding it, but he read the Bible there. Like a deacon, I think he never was ordained a deacon, right. So yeah. he crossed a little bit by the borders there. However, that was something he arranged indeed.
As you mentioned, in Francis' own lifetime, he was inundated with followers, and those followers continued to grow after his death. And soon after, there were lots of disagreements, and maybe even his own lifetime, around what did it mean to really emulate Francis properly, and what did Francis really mean when he said poor, and how many things can we own? Is it just the sandals and the habit? Can you talk about maybe the end of his life and early Franciscan movements, maybe even before we segue to Martin Luther? I'd love to hear about Francis' legacy.
So in the end of his life, he was afraid that people would call themselves poor without living in a poor way. That's why he wrote his testament, his last words, that just wanted to encourage people really to have no luxurious clothes, not rich buildings. So that was this appeal to live in a poor style. But then after his death, the Pope decided that's only private testament. So binding is the rule, and with the rule written by lawyers, you can compromise to a certain degree, and that's what many Franciscans did in the following century, while others stick to the testament and said that's what our founder said. And our now saint founder, he was canonized 2 years after his death. That's where all those quarrels came from, which is strange insofar as he never wanted to have any quarrel. He was not agonistic in any sense, but he was used for those quarrels.
And there are different sorts of questions that need to be asked when you have thousands of followers who need to live in a place, who need food, who need some form of education, right? So in a sense, I suppose that the Franciscan movement was a victim of its own success. It needed to entertain questions that Francis, probably in his early days, didn't quite need to entertain.
And the success, as some of them saw it, was included that they were the spearheads of the end of the times. So they saw in St. Francis the one who would open the way to the coming of Jesus Christ. That also was part of success, but of course that was part of the problems.
Yes. So let's fast forward in the few moments that we have left, and I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit about Martin Luther as a cradle Catholic. I certainly never connected the dots between Luther and mysticism. Of course, now that I begin to read you more and more, it makes perfect sense about the kind of directness of encounter that certainly is not without the sacraments and the need for the church. But as I begin to widen my frame, I'm heartened to hear of the mystical dimensions of Luther's life and his teachings. But can you sort of fill in the gaps for a Catholic educated but eager student of Martin Luther?
So for the Catholic educated, the first thing would be, we talked about two mendicants, a Dominican, Meister Eckhart, a Franciscan, St. Francis. And now we talk about the third mendicant. Martin Luther was an Augustinian, so that's a common role they came into. And then we see Martin Luther was a reader of John Tauler. And now that's what excites a historian so much. What we have are his Magellan notes to John Tauler. So when you write a letter, you want someone to see you as you want to be seen. So that's how you write a letter, how you write a book, or how you go to a podcast. So it's always you present yourself somehow. You don't do this when you write Magellan notes. The Magellan notes are only for you. So we really see Martin Luther working on this. And in these Magellan notes, he developed his understanding particularly of penance. So he read in John Tauler that John Tauler says, even if you fall into sin 70 times a day, still return to God intensely and don't go with this to your confessor, but go directly to God. And there Martin Luther just wrote a few words, nota bene. So note this very well. Or the second one he wrote, utilissimum consilium, very useful counsel. And if you then look at his 95 theses, with which he came into public in 1517, the first two theses say, first, our entire life should be penance. So think about 70 times a day you return to God. That's this one. The second thesis says that's not what is called sacramental penance, but shortly said, it is only about your remorse. And there you are very close to this, what John Tauler said, don't go to the confessor. So this Tauler reading shows up in Martin Luther's 95 Theses. That was something which I suddenly noticed. After reading John Tauler, I read again Martin Luther and I said, well, I heard about this. And I compared them, and then I found this letter of Martin Luther in early 1518 when he wrote to his confessor, surprised about all the uproar he has instigated with his thesis. I only wanted to say what John Tauler said. He didn't want to say more. Of course, he said a bit more over the years, but at this moment, he just followed the steps of late medieval mysticism, and we can see this throughout his life. We can see that when he framed justification, that was very close to his mystical reading. Even again, looking into his marginal notes, there is a note where he says, what remains is nuda fides in Deum, the naked faith into God. If we understand justification in Luther's terms, it is justification sola fide, by faith alone. Naked faith, by faith alone. That's very close together. So what he means is, like we had it before in Meister Eckhart, you detach from everything that is your own, and Luther would very much say that is sin, that is original sin, and what remains is our relation to God. Of course, he uses more the words of St. Paul and St. Augustine speaking about faith, but that's his tradition, and later on he would develop his understanding of the Eucharist in a mystical way. We become one cake with Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. We come very close to it.
Let me ask you the same question about Martin Luther that I asked about Meister Eckhart, and that is, let's take sort of your teaching here at Yale Divinity School. What do you find your students most get wrong about Martin Luther, or what preconceptions do they bring that you may need to subtly, graciously disabuse them of?
So first of all, my students never do anything wrong. Second, I think if they come to class with kind of cultural memory of Martin Luther, they would reduce Martin Luther to his writing against the Jews, which are unbearable, which are violent, which writings I would have wished him that he never had written them. They are part of the German history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So we have to talk about them, and I always do in classes, but it is not the only thing in Martin Luther. And so it is great to go with my students on a journey to understand Martin Luther from the beginning throughout his life, including those sides like his violent anti-Judaism.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what are the questions you're still asking as a scholar, as a theologian? What are the projects that you're eager to explore? I mean, if you did nothing else, you'd still be prolific. Over a dozen books and many, many articles, and teaching new courses all the time. When a lot of scholars are sort of teaching the old favorites, and we'd love you if you did nothing more than that. But what are the things that are still sort of driving your curiosity?
So it is not like I'm feeling I'm in retirement now. So throughout my life I learned more and more about gender conceptions in Christianity, and my next project will be a book about Mary Magdalene and the conception of her as a saint and a sinner. What comes together in the mind of people thinking this together. It's a very Lutheran approach to think about a penitent, but I think about a saint penitent. So that's my overall Christian approach.
Mm-hmm. Professor Leppin, thank you so much for your scholarship, for your faith, and for being on the Leaders Way podcast.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us today on the Leaders Way podcast, a show for people who are not ready to give up on the world. We hope you found the episode expansive and nourishing. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. Your support helps us to continue bringing you sacred conversations with luminaries, scholars, and spiritual leaders who are dedicated to transforming our world. For more information about our guests and to catch up on past episodes, visit our website at berkeleydivinity.yale.edu. Follow the show on Instagram at theleadersway.podcast to stay updated on future episodes and events. Until next time, I'm Dr. Brandon Nappi, walking with you as you lead with courage, wisdom, and compassion.